The government is not creating an environment conducive to free and credible elections. The Council will be fully briefed on the 20th of March, and my office will be releasing a detailed report in the coming days. I draw this Council's attention to the deteriorating human rights situation in Tanzania, including heavy-handed restrictions on media freedoms and on civil society, and an increasing number of attacks on and arrests of government critics. The government has also taken an increasingly repressive approach to important social issues, with arrests of LGBTI activists, growing attacks on the LGBTI community, and attacks and threats against people working to provide reproductive health care. The government's policy of permanently refusing any further education to girls who become pregnant is shocking, and I am disturbed by the High Court's finding that such a policy is not discriminatory. In Ethiopia, I welcome the release of more than 7,000 detainees in January and February, including several high-profile figures. I am concerned about the declaration of a second state of emergency last month. Reforms can only be carried out successfully through truly inclusive dialogue and political processes. I urge the authorities to investigate and prosecute those responsible for recent killings in the country, and I reiterate my request for access to affected regions. In Zimbabwe, I encourage the newly formed government to enact economic reforms to address inequalities and lay the foundations for truly sustainable and inclusive development based on human rights. It is also time to open civic and democratic space in the country, allowing all citizens to participate, associate, and express their opinions freely. In this connection, I am concerned about the recent amendments to the Constitution which rolled back gains on the independence of the judiciary, a real setback for reform. Mr. President, in Turkey, respect for fundamental rights continues to deteriorate. My office has received credible reports of arbitrary mass dismissals, arbitrary closure of civil society organizations, arbitrary detention of people arrested on broad allegations of links to terrorist organizations, torture in detention, restrictions on freedom of expression and freedom of movement, arbitrary expropriation of private property, and collective punishment targeting family members of individuals suspected of offenses. Given these deepening concerns, we will be releasing a detailed report in the coming days on the human rights situation in the context of the state of emergency, including an update on the situation in the southeast. Mr. President, over two-thirds of the national parliaments in European Union countries now include political parties with extreme positions against migrants, and in some cases, Muslims and other minority communities. This discourse, based on racism, xenophobia, and incitement to hatred, has now expanded so significantly that in several countries it is dominating the political landscape, as we saw during the election campaign in Italy in recent weeks. On migration policy, I am deeply concerned about the current overriding focus of EU states on preventing migrants from reaching Europe and rushing to deport many who do. The EU and its members need to review the approach they are taking in the Mediterranean to ensure that they are not indirectly supporting the return of migrants to Libya, where they face a real risk of torture, sexual offense, and other serious violations. I also call on the EU to adopt a human rights due diligence approach to their support to any Libyan authorities. In Austria, the new government, which includes an openly anti-migrant party, has announced it will embark on stringent surveillance financial restrictions, or closure of associations, Muslim schools, and places of worship, broad criminalization of irregular migrants with the stated intention to automatically expel them, and the adoption of extremely restrictive language on integration and citizenship. In Poland, over the past several years, reforms targeting the Constitutional Court and the judiciary have paved the way for partisan interpretation of the Constitution and domestic laws and severely weakened checks and balances. Other measures introduced by the government have compromised the right to freedom of assembly, politicized the office of the Prosecutor General, increased the powers of the secret services, and led to a significant strengthening of control by the executive branch over the judiciary, the media, civil society, and other spheres of public life. I am disturbed by widespread reports that the government frequently takes a passive approach to the growing number of hate crimes and incidents of hate speech against minority communities and migrants. In the Russian Federation, I'm deeply concerned at what appears to be an orchestrated and coordinated campaign of violence and threats against members of a leading human rights group, Memorial Human Rights Center in Chechnya, Ingushetia, and Dagestan. I call on the authorities to conduct prompt and impartial investigations and to ensure the perpetrators are held to account. I also urge the authorities to fully uphold the right to political participation in the context of this month's presidential vote, to conduct policing of public gatherings in line with international standards, and to ensure freedoms of peaceful assembly, association, and expression. Mr. President, the human rights situation in Venezuela is deeply alarming. Malnutrition has increased dramatically throughout the country, affecting in particular children and the elderly. And credible reports indicate that government assistance programs are often conditioned on political considerations. I'm also deeply alarmed by the possibility that crimes against humanity have been committed and by the erosion of democratic institutions. The fundamental principle of separation of powers has been severely compromised. My office has also received credible reports of hundreds of extrajudicial killings in recent years, both during protests and security operations. I am seriously concerned that this context does not in any way fulfill minimal conditions for free and credible elections. I am deeply disturbed by the growing exodus of Venezuelans from their country, many of them in search of access to food and basic services. Once again, I encourage the Council to consider mandating a commission of inquiry to investigate human rights violations in Venezuela. In Honduras, I am alarmed at the surge in threats and intimidation against human rights defenders, journalists, media workers, and social and political activists. My office will release a report in the coming days detailing excessive use of force and mass arrests in response to protests which took place following the 2017 November elections, and the Council will be briefed on the 21st of March. In the United States, I'm shocked by reports that migrants intercepted at the southern borders, including children, are detained in abusive conditions, such as freezing temperatures, and that some young children are being detained separately from their families. Detentions and deportations of long-standing and law-abiding migrants have sharply increased, tearing families apart and creating enormous hardship. I deplore the continuing uncertainty about beneficiaries of the DACA program. I'm also concerned about the U.S. decision to revoke the planned closure of the detention center at Guantanamo Bay. Indefinite incarceration in this facility without trial and in frequently inhumane conditions constitutes a breach of international law. I'm also concerned about proposals that could drastically reduce social protections, particularly in the light of the concerns expressed by the Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights following his visit to the US in December. In my meetings with the authorities in Uruguay, I commended their very significant efforts to integrate human rights into public policies. I trust we will see progress regarding violence against women and the very difficult conditions for adolescents in detention. In El Salvador, I am alarmed by consistent reports of extrajudicial killings by the security forces, fueled by very weak accountability for these crimes. Moves to disband or restructure police units which have been accused of extrajudicial killings do not replace the need to hold perpetrators to account. The situation of women and girls in the country continues to be deeply troubling, with rates of murder and violence against women among the highest in the region and frequently committed with impunity. Mr. President, during my mission to El Salvador in November, I was shaken by the draconian impact of the country's absolute prohibition of abortion. As of October last year, at least 159 women have been imprisoned since 1998 under this legislation. More than 20 of them for aggravated homicide and sentenced to between 30 and 40 years in jail. Many say they in fact suffered miscarriages or other obstetric emergencies. And all of those currently detained happen to be poor. Time and again, it is always the poor everywhere who, having no access to strong legal counsel, no family connections, no money with which to travel outside the country, suffer terribly. Always the poor. One young woman whom I met in detention was recently released following the commutation of her 30-year jail sentence. However, she has not been declared innocent and has received no reparations for the more than 10 years that she has spent in jail. And when many in the country want to raise the penalty beyond 30 years to 50 years, it brought home to me how cruel we humans can be and the unchallengeable need for human rights. I don't mind telling council members, all of us who heard the testimony of the young women at the Ilopango detention center wept openly with them. El Salvador should halt further application of this poorly conceived legislation and immediately review all cases where women have been detained for abortion-related offenses. It takes real courage to stand up for women's rights, including sexual and reproductive rights in many parts of the world in this 21st century. In countries across every region, women are suffering from increasingly regressive legislation, threats against activists, and a renewed obsession with controlling their decisions. In the past year, a new movement for justice has risen up to combat the abuse and sexual exploitation of women, the Me Too movement, an expression of solidarity and a force for dignity that is much needed, including in the wealthiest societies. Wherever I have traveled, I have been privileged to meet women who defy restrictions on their freedom. These resilient and powerful women teach us, have indeed taught me, that every individual can help to reshape society and the world. I don't much like the phrase speaking truth to power, because in reality, it is not rank which confers moral value. The power is in truth itself. I commend the many civil society movements fighting for decency and respect for human rights, including the rights of indigenous people, facing unprecedented